Everyone was told not to touch this dog. The soldiers believed it brought disaster, haunting their mountain outpost with an eerie presence. But one soldier couldn't ignore its limp and sad eyes. Against orders, he reached out, and everything changed. The dog wasn't just surviving the brutal conditions. What happened when this soldier disobeyed? And why was this dog feared by everyone? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The military transport truck rumbled to a halt, its wheels crunching on the packed snow. Aaron Warner stepped down from the back, his boots hitting the frozen ground with a soft thud. His breath came out in white puffs as the bitter mountain air hit his lungs. The cold seemed to reach right through his thick winter uniform. The outpost sprawled before him, a collection of weathered buildings that had clearly seen better days. Patches of rust peeked through the snow-covered roofs of the barracks, and icicles hung like jagged teeth from the eaves. A few soldiers trudged past, heads down against the wind, not even glancing his way. "Warner, over here!" A gruff voice cut through the whistling wind. Sergeant Logan stood waiting, his face weathered like the mountains themselves. His stern expression made Aaron straighten his spine automatically. "Sir, Medic Aaron Warner reporting for duty," Aaron said, fighting to keep his teeth from chattering. The sergeant gave a curt nod. "Follow me, and keep up. Weather turns fast up here." As they walked, Sergeant Logan pointed out the essential buildings: mess hall, medical bay, supply depot. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much. "This isn't some cushy hospital post, Warner. Mountain warfare doesn't care if you're a medic or a grunt. Nature kills just the same." Aaron nodded, taking in every detail. That's when he saw it, a lean figure slinking between buildings. A husky, its fur almost white against the snow, watching them with intense eyes. Despite its thin frame, the dog moved with quiet purpose. "Sir, whose dog is that?" Aaron asked. A nearby soldier overheard and spat into the snow. "That ain't nobody's dog. That's Ghost. Bad luck, that one. Shows up before every disaster like some kind of spirit. Lost Jake Thompson in a blizzard last winter. Ghost was howling all night before it happened." "Enough," Sergeant Logan snapped, but Aaron noticed how the older man's eyes darted nervously toward the dog. "Warner, stay focused on your duties. That animal is off limits. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Aaron replied, though he couldn't help watching as Ghost melted away into the shadows between buildings. Later that night, Aaron sat on his thin mattress in the barracks, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. Through the frosted window, he could see the snow falling harder now, the wind driving it sideways in white sheets. A movement caught his eye. Ghost, standing at the edge of the light from a lamppost. The husky's fur rippled in the wind as it stood perfectly still, watching the building. Then, as if sensing Aaron's gaze, Ghost turned and looked directly at him. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass. There was something in those eyes, not the malevolence the soldiers feared, but something deeper, something almost human. In the next instant, the blizzard intensified, and Ghost seemed to dissolve into the whirling snow, becoming one with the storm. Aaron stared at the empty space where the dog had been, his mind full of questions about this mysterious creature and the strange power it held over the hardened soldiers of the mountain outpost. The morning came with a harsh blast from a whistle that jolted Aaron from his sleep. His muscles ached from the thin mattress, and his breath hung visible in the freezing air of the barracks. Even inside, the cold seemed to seep through every crack and corner. "Rise and shine, Doc," Corporal Diaz called out, already dressed and looking surprisingly cheerful. "Better move quick. Hot water runs out fast here." Aaron fumbled with his boots, his fingers stiff from the cold. By the time he made it to the showers, the water was barely lukewarm. Still, Diaz waited for him outside, offering a steaming cup of coffee. "You'll get used to it," Diaz said, his friendly smile a stark contrast to the grim faces around them. "Come on, I'll show you where the medical supplies are kept." The morning passed in a blur of inventory lists and organization. Aaron's medical training had prepared him for emergency situations, but no one had mentioned how much paperwork would be involved. Diaz stayed nearby, helping him navigate the base's system while sharing stories about his own first weeks at the outpost. At lunch, Aaron found himself seated with a small group of soldiers in the mess hall. The conversation turned, as it seemed to often do, to Ghost. "You saw him yet, Doc?" Private Jenkins asked, leaning forward over his tray. "That dog ain't natural." "I saw it yesterday," Aaron admitted, stirring his soup. "Then you better watch yourself," another soldier warned. Ghost was Jake Thompson's shadow for weeks before that blizzard hit. Jake thought the dog was helping him, leading him to better patrol routes. Then one night, worst storm we'd seen in years rolls in. Jake follows Ghost out there, saying the dog was acting strange. Never saw Jake again. "Found his body when the snow cleared," Jenkins added quietly. "Ghost just disappeared after that. But every time it shows up now, something goes wrong. Equipment failures, accidents, you name it." Aaron noticed how even Diaz grew serious during these stories, though the corporal remained silent. He wanted to point out that correlation didn't equal causation, that a smart dog might actually be trying to warn people of danger, but he kept these thoughts to himself. He was still the newcomer here. As evening approached, Aaron headed to the supply tent for a final inventory check. The wind had picked up, carrying loose snow across the ground in swirling patterns. That's when he saw Ghost, moving with an obvious limp near the corner of the tent. The husky's white fur was matted on one side, and it favored its right front paw. Despite its injury, those intelligent eyes watched Aaron with careful assessment, neither afraid nor aggressive. Aaron stood perfectly still, remembering all the warnings he'd heard throughout the day. The soldiers' stories echoed in his mind: bad luck, death omens, disaster. But his medical training and conscience screamed louder. He could see the pain in the way Ghost held its body, could recognize the signs of an animal in need of help. Looking at the injured creature, Aaron made his decision. If Ghost showed up again, he would help it, regardless of the superstitions surrounding it. The base fell silent as lights out approached, broken only by the howling wind and occasional creaks from the aging barracks. Aaron waited until the steady breathing of his fellow soldiers filled the room before quietly slipping from his bunk. He pulled on his thermal layers and heavy coat, careful not to let the fabric rustle too much. In his pocket, he had stashed a small first aid kit during his evening inventory. He'd also managed to save half his dinner roll and some dried meat, wrapped carefully in a napkin. The guilt of breaking curfew gnawed at him, but the image of Ghost's limping figure wouldn't leave his mind. The cold hit him like a physical blow as he stepped outside. Moonlight reflected off the snow, casting everything in an ethereal glow that made the outpost feel even more isolated. Aaron's boots crunched softly as he made his way to the supply tent, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. He settled down on an empty crate near where he'd last seen Ghost, placing the food on the ground beside him. The wind cut through his layers, and he pulled his collar higher, fighting the urge to shiver. Minutes ticked by, marked only by the subtle shifting of shadows and snow. Just as his fingers began to grow numb, movement caught his eye. Ghost emerged from the darkness like its namesake, frost clinging to its thick fur. The husky's eyes gleamed in the moonlight, fixed steadily on Aaron as it kept its injured paw slightly raised. "Hey there," Aaron whispered, keeping his voice soft and steady. "It's okay. I just want to help." He moved slowly, deliberately, as he opened the first aid kit. Ghost watched every movement but didn't retreat. When Aaron extended his hand, palm up, the dog took a cautious step forward. "That's it," Aaron encouraged, his heart pounding as Ghost drew closer. "Let me see that paw." The examination revealed a deep cut on the pad, likely from sharp ice or hidden metal. Aaron cleaned the wound with gentle movements, speaking quietly the whole time. Ghost stood perfectly still, only the occasional twitch betraying its discomfort as Aaron wrapped the paw in a light bandage. "All done," Aaron said, sitting back. "There's some food here if you want it." Ghost regarded him for a long moment, those intelligent eyes seeming to look straight through him. Then, without touching the offered meal, the husky turned and melted back into the swirling snow, leaving nothing but paw prints behind. Aaron felt a mixture of pride and concern as he gathered his supplies. He'd helped the dog, but now he had to get back without being seen. The return trip to the barracks seemed longer, every shadow potentially hiding a patrol. As he approached his building, voices drifted through the thin walls. He pressed himself against the cold metal, recognizing Private Jenkins and another soldier on guard duty. "Weird tracks by the supply tent," Jenkins was saying. "Has to be that damn dog again." "Great, more bad luck," the other soldier muttered. "Someone must be feeding it. Only reason it'd stick around." Aaron's heart raced as he slipped back inside, carefully making his way to his bunk. As he lay there in the darkness, he wondered if helping Ghost had been worth the risk. The warmth of his bed did nothing to quiet his churning thoughts. The mountain outpost settled into its daily rhythm as Aaron went about his duties. He noticed Ghost's presence more frequently now. A flash of fur behind the mess tent, alert eyes watching from behind supply crates, or silent paw prints in fresh snow near the medical building. The husky maintained its careful distance from the other soldiers, but seemed to track Aaron's movements with growing interest. One crisp morning, while checking inventory outside the medical supplies tent, Aaron spotted Ghost observing him from the shadow of a nearby building. The dog's bandaged paw had healed well, though it still favored that leg slightly. Making a quick decision, Aaron pulled some leftover breakfast from his pocket and placed it behind a stack of empty crates where it wouldn't be easily noticed. "Might as well put this to better use," he murmured, stepping away to continue his work. During lunch that day, Aaron sat with Corporal Diaz, hoping to learn more about the mysterious dog. The corporal spoke between bites of his meal, his voice low to avoid drawing attention. "That dog's something else," Diaz said, glancing around the mess tent. "Been here longer than most of us. Survived blizzards that trapped entire patrols. Made it through firefights that should have killed anything living. Always shows up again, no matter what." Aaron leaned forward, intrigued. "How long has it been here?" "Years now. Started with Jake's unit." Diaz's expression grew serious. "Listen, Warner, I see how you look at that dog. But whatever you're thinking, don't. Sergeant's strict about protocol, and he especially hates anything to do with Ghost. Not worth risking your position here." That night, unable to sleep, Aaron slipped out of the barracks again. The temperature had dropped sharply, making his breath visible in the moonlight. He made his way to the spot where he'd left the food, and there was Ghost, waiting. The dog's posture was different this time, less rigid, ears relaxed instead of alert. Aaron settled onto a crate several feet away, careful to move slowly. Ghost watched him, but didn't retreat, and for several minutes they sat in comfortable silence, sharing the quiet night. Then, something remarkable happened. Ghost took a tentative step toward the food Aaron had left earlier. Without taking its eyes off Aaron, the dog carefully picked up a piece of dried meat. Aaron held perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as Ghost ate the food while remaining in his presence, a small but significant display of trust. The moment was shattered by the crunch of boots on snow. Aaron's heart sank as he heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by hurried footsteps heading toward the sergeant's quarters. Private Jenkins' voice carried clearly through the cold air. "Sergeant, you need to see this." Ghost vanished instantly into the darkness, leaving Aaron alone to face the consequences of his actions. The next morning dawned gray and bitter. Aaron's boots crunched through fresh snow as he made his way to the sergeant's office, his stomach tight with anxiety. The small wooden building loomed ahead, smoke curling from its chimney into the pale sky. Inside, Sergeant Logan stood behind his desk, his weathered face hard as stone. The office felt suffocating despite the chill. Maps covered the walls, and a single lamp cast harsh shadows across the room. Private Warner," the sergeant's voice cut through the silence. "Care to explain why you were out after hours, feeding that dog?" Aaron straightened his spine. "Sir, That wasn't a real question, son." The sergeant's fist came down on his desk. "You deliberately disobeyed standing orders. That animal is off limits, period." "Sir, with respect, Ghost is just a stray that needs help. I'm a medic. Helping is what I do." The sergeant's eyes narrowed. "That thing isn't just some stray, Warner. It's been here for years, bringing nothing but trouble. You think you're the first bleeding heart to try helping it?" He moved around the desk, standing directly in front of Aaron. "Let me tell you about Jake's unit. 6 good men caught in a blizzard. That dog led them straight into it. Only 5 came back." The sergeant's voice grew quiet, dangerous. "Every time that mutt shows up, something goes wrong. Equipment failures, accidents, men getting hurt." "Correlation doesn't mean causation, sir," Aaron said, immediately regretting his words. "This isn't your civilian hospital, Warner. Up here we follow orders. We respect the signs. That dog is bad luck, and your bleeding heart is putting everyone at risk." Aaron tried one more time. "Sir, Ghost has survived years up here. Maybe it could help." "Enough." The sergeant's voice boomed off the walls. "One more incident like this, and you'll be scrubbing latrines for a month before I recommend disciplinary action. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir," Aaron replied stiffly. "Dismissed." Aaron stepped out into the biting morning air, his mind churning. As he walked back toward the barracks, movement caught his eye. Ghost stood at the tree line, its pale fur almost invisible against the snow. The dog's eyes met his, seeming to hold a question. Aaron raised his hand, making a shooing motion. "Go on," he whispered, his chest tight. "Get out of here." The dog tilted its head, watching him for a moment longer before melting away into the wilderness. The days crept by in a blur of white and gray. Aaron threw himself into his duties, organizing medical supplies and tending to the occasional minor injuries that came with mountain training. Though he kept his distance from Ghost as ordered, he couldn't help noticing the dog's silvery form hovering at the edges of his vision, a constant shadow in the swirling snow. One evening, as Aaron conducted his weekly outdoor inventory of the emergency medical cache, the temperature dropped sharply. His breath formed crystals in the air as he counted supplies by flashlight. A soft whine caught his attention. Ghost stood 20 feet away, its behavior completely different from its usual calm vigilance. The dog paced back and forth, letting out quiet, urgent barks, more like whispers than warnings. Its eyes kept darting toward the mountain slope behind the base. Aaron's hand tightened on his flashlight. The sergeant's warnings echoed in his mind, but something in Ghost's demeanor spoke of real concern, not superstition. After a moment's hesitation, he secured the medical cache and followed the dog. Ghost led him along the perimeter fence, staying just ahead but frequently looking back as if making sure Aaron kept up. They reached a small rocky outcropping where the dog stopped and pawed at a patch of disturbed snow. Aaron swept his flashlight beam across the area. The snow's surface looked wrong, too smooth in some places, lumpy in others. Kneeling down, he began carefully brushing away the powder. His heart nearly stopped when his gloved hand struck something thin and metallic, a tripwire. Following it carefully, he uncovered the crude but deadly explosive device it was attached to. The setup was amateur but effective, clearly the work of enemy scouts testing the base's defenses. With shaking hands, Aaron marked the location and hurried back to report his discovery. The sergeant was still in his office when Aaron burst in with the news. A team quickly secured and disarmed the device. As they worked, the sergeant pulled Aaron aside, his expression stern but somewhat softened. "Good work spotting this, Warner," he said gruffly. "Could have lost some men if that thing had gone unnoticed." "Sir," Aaron ventured, "Ghost was the one who—" "Don't push it," the sergeant cut him off. "You found the device, that's what matters. But don't go thinking this changes anything about that dog. Dismissed." Later that night, Aaron slipped out to Ghost's usual spot with a double portion of his dinner rations. The dog materialized from the shadows, closer than it had ever come before. "Thank you," Aaron whispered as Ghost carefully took the food. Instead of retreating immediately, the dog settled down just a few feet away, eating while Aaron watched. For the first time, Aaron felt like they were truly connecting, two outcasts finding common ground in the endless snow. The following afternoon found Aaron helping Corporal Diaz repair a broken generator. As they worked in companionable silence, Aaron's thoughts drifted to Ghost. The dog's intelligence and loyalty during the tripwire incident had only deepened his curiosity about its past. "Corporal," Aaron said, wiping grease from his hands, "what really happened with Ghost and Jake? I keep hearing different versions." Diaz paused, setting down his wrench. His usually cheerful face grew somber. "I was here when it happened. Jake was a good kid. Reminded me a bit of you, actually. Had a big heart." He settled against the generator, his eyes distant. "Ghost showed up as a pup, maybe 2 years ago. Jake started feeding it, just like you did. Before long, they were inseparable. The dog would follow him on patrols, sleep outside his bunk. Jake even taught it some basic commands." Aaron listened intently as Diaz continued. "One night, we had a supply drop go wrong. Strong winds knocked a crate of medical supplies down the mountain slope. Jake volunteered to retrieve it, said we couldn't afford to lose those supplies. The sergeant ordered him to wait until morning, but Jake—" Diaz shook his head. "He snuck out during the night." "And Ghost followed him?" Aaron asked softly. "Yeah. We didn't even know they were gone until the morning patrol found their tracks. By then, the storm had turned into a full blizzard." Diaz's voice grew quiet. "We searched for 3 days once the weather cleared. Found Jake frozen solid behind a rock outcropping about 2 miles down. Ghost was curled up next to him, barely breathing. The dog must have tried to keep him warm." Aaron's chest tightened at the image. "But Ghost survived." "Barely. The base medic at the time treated its frostbite. Everyone expected the dog to die or leave, but it stayed. Started appearing before storms or when things were about to go wrong. Some guys say Jake's spirit is warning us through the dog. Others think Ghost brings the bad luck itself." Aaron watched through the window as snowflakes began to fall. "But Ghost isn't causing anything. It's trying to help, just like it did with Jake." "Maybe," Diaz said, "but superstition runs deep up here. Sometimes believing in omens is easier than facing reality." That evening, Aaron sat on his bunk, turning Diaz's words over in his mind. The story painted Ghost in a new light, not as a harbinger of doom, but as a loyal companion who had experienced profound loss. The dog hadn't given up after Jake's death. Instead, it had somehow transformed its grief into a mission to watch over others. Looking out his window, Aaron spotted Ghost's familiar form near the supply tent. The dog stood alert against the darkening sky, scanning the perimeter as it always did. Aaron felt a surge of determination. Ghost wasn't bad luck. It was a survivor, adapting and persisting despite tragedy. In that moment, Aaron decided the sergeant's warnings wouldn't stop him from helping the dog. In this harsh mountain outpost, perhaps they could both find purpose in watching out for each other. The mountain outpost buzzed with nervous energy as reports of enemy movement filtered in. Soldiers huddled in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about increased patrols and potential attacks. Equipment checks became more frequent, and every creak of the old buildings set people on edge. "Third radio malfunction this week," muttered Private Chen, tossing a broken handset onto his desk. "Ever since that dog started hanging around more." Aaron bit his tongue, focusing on organizing medical supplies instead of responding. He'd noticed Ghost staying closer to the barracks lately, as if sensing the rising tension. The dog would appear silently between buildings, watching the increased patrols with alert eyes. Late one evening, as Aaron returned from checking on a soldier with a sprained ankle, he heard angry voices near the mess hall. The sound of something hitting metal rang out, followed by a yelp that made his heart skip. "Get out of here, you cursed mutt!" someone shouted. Aaron rounded the corner to find 3 soldiers hurling rocks at Ghost, who was backing away from an overturned garbage can. The dog's eyes reflected fear in the dim light, its tail tucked low. "Hey, stop that!" Aaron rushed forward, placing himself between Ghost and the soldiers. "What's wrong with you?" "Stay out of this, Warner," Private Miller warned, another rock ready in his hand. "That thing's brought nothing but trouble." "Trouble?" Aaron's voice rose with anger. "Ghost helped us find that tripwire last week. Could have saved all our lives." "One lucky break doesn't make up for everything else," Chen joined in. "Equipment failures, Jensen's broken arm, increased enemy activity. It all started when you encouraged that thing to stick around." "That's ridiculous," Aaron shot back. Other soldiers began gathering around them. "Ghost isn't causing any of that. It's just a dog trying to help, just like it tried to help Jake." The mention of Jake's name sent a ripple through the crowd. Corporal Diaz stepped forward, positioning himself near Aaron. "He's got a point. Maybe we're being too hard on the dog." "You're both soft," Miller spat. "This isn't some pet shelter. We're in a war zone, and that thing is bad news." The argument grew louder as more soldiers took sides. Some defended Ghost, recounting times they'd seen the dog alert patrols to danger. Others blamed it for every misfortune the base had experienced. "What's going on here?" Sergeant Logan's commanding voice cut through the chaos. The crowd parted as he strode forward, his face hard with anger. "Sir, they were throwing rocks at Ghost," Aaron reported, standing his ground. "Warner." The sergeant's voice carried a dangerous edge. "I've warned you about that dog. Now you're causing dissension in my unit over it?" "But sir—" "Enough!" The sergeant's voice boomed across the yard. "Everyone back to their posts. Warner, this is your last warning. Stay in line, or you'll face serious consequences. That dog is not your responsibility." The crowd dispersed quickly, leaving Aaron standing alone in the cold. He watched Ghost limping away into the darkness, its white fur fading like mist among the shadows. Despite the sergeant's threats, Aaron made a silent promise to keep helping Ghost, no matter the cost. 3 days after the confrontation, nature unleashed its fury. A massive blizzard descended on the mountain outpost, bringing howling winds that rattled the windows and drove snow horizontally through the air. Inside the barracks, soldiers huddled around small electric heaters, their breath visible even indoors as the temperature continued to drop. "Haven't seen one this bad in years," Corporal Diaz said, wrapping his blanket tighter. The wind screamed outside, drowning out most conversation. Aaron sat near a window, watching the white wall of snow obliterate everything beyond the glass. The storm had reduced visibility to almost nothing. He could barely make out the building across the yard. The radio crackled to life, startling everyone. "Base, this is Patrol Team Charlie. We're..." Static consumed the rest of the message. Sergeant Logan burst into the barracks, his face grim. "Charlie Team missed their check-in. Last known position was near Ridge Point 3. A heavy silence fell over the room. Ridge Point 3 was exposed, dangerous terrain even in good weather. "I need volunteers for search and rescue," the sergeant announced. No one moved. The howling wind emphasized the deadly conditions waiting outside. Aaron stood up. "I'll go, sir. They'll need medical attention." A few soldiers shifted uncomfortably, but still didn't volunteer. The sergeant's jaw tightened as he surveyed the room. "Sir!" Aaron pointed through the window. "Look!" Through the swirling snow, Ghost's white form was barely visible. The dog paced along the perimeter fence, barking and looking toward the mountains. Its behavior was different from anything Aaron had seen before. More urgent, more insistent. "The dog knows something's wrong," Aaron said. "It can help us find them." "Absolutely not," Sergeant Logan growled. "We're not following that." "I'll go too," Corporal Diaz interrupted, standing up. "Warner's right. Ghost knows these mountains better than any of us." Two more soldiers reluctantly volunteered, spurred by Diaz's example. As they gathered their cold weather gear and rescue equipment, Aaron could see Ghost was still pacing, waiting. "Sir," Aaron faced the sergeant, "please. Ghost found that tripwire. It's tried to help us before. Those men won't survive long in this cold. We need every advantage we can get." The sergeant looked at his small rescue team, then at the raging storm outside. His expression was torn between his superstitions and the desperate situation. "Fine," he finally spat. "But if anything goes wrong..." They pushed through the heavy snow, Ghost leading the way. The dog seemed to know exactly where to go, choosing paths that offered some shelter from the brutal wind. Up they climbed, the slope becoming steeper and more treacherous. Suddenly, Ghost stopped, barking frantically. Aaron squinted through the snow and spotted a dark shape against the white, a human hand sticking out of a snowbank. They found the patrol team half buried in the snow, huddled together and barely conscious. Aaron immediately began checking vital signs while Ghost continued barking, looking towards something in the distance. "There's a cave up ahead," Diaz shouted over the wind, pointing where Ghost was indicating. "We can shelter there." Inside the cave, the rescue team huddled together for warmth, while Aaron worked quickly to treat the injured patrol members. His medical training kicked in as he checked for frostbite and hypothermia, wrapping the soldiers in emergency blankets from their rescue packs. As he moved around the cave, the beam from his flashlight caught something unusual on the rough walls. Aaron paused, directing the light closer. There were scratches etched into the stone, distinctive marks that looked like paw prints dragging downward. Next to them, barely visible, were the faint outlines of human boot prints preserved in old mud. "This cave..." Private Matthews, one of the older soldiers, spoke up. His voice trembled slightly. "This is where they found Jake and Ghost." A tense silence fell over the group. The wind howled outside, making the cave feel smaller and more oppressive. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier relief at finding shelter now tainted with superstition. "Bad luck," someone whispered. "We shouldn't be here." "It's following us," another added. "Jake's ghost, using that dog to lead us to our deaths." Aaron continued his work, but his mind was racing. He studied the marks on the wall again, understanding flooding through him. The scratches weren't random. They were concentrated near what looked like a natural shelter in the cave wall, the perfect size for a person to huddle in during a storm. "Ghost wasn't leading Jake to his death," Aaron said softly. "It was trying to guide him here, to safety, just like it did for us today." The storm's fury began to diminish, the howling wind gradually dying down to a whisper. Through the cave entrance, they could see the sky beginning to clear. The group gathered their gear, preparing for the trek back to base. Before joining them, Aaron walked to the wall and placed his hand on the old paw prints. "Thank you," he whispered, understanding now that Ghost wasn't an omen of death, but a guardian of these mountains. At the cave entrance, Ghost sat waiting, its white fur blending with the fresh snow. As the group filed out, the dog watched them silently, then melted away into the swirling snowflakes like a spirit returning to its realm. The rescue party trudged back through the snow, supporting the injured patrol members between them. As they approached the outpost gates, soldiers rushed out to help, quickly transferring the wounded to the medical bay. Aaron's hands shook from cold and exhaustion as he followed them inside, knowing he needed to report to the sergeant. In the sergeant's office, the warmth from the heater did little to thaw the icy reception. Aaron stood at attention, explaining how Ghost had led them to the missing patrol and the cave that saved their lives. The sergeant's face remained hard as stone. "You deliberately disobeyed orders, Warner, following a stray dog into a blizzard. You could have gotten everyone killed." "But sir, without Ghost..." "Without proper protocol, we'd have chaos," the sergeant cut him off. "This isn't about the dog. It's about chain of command. One lucky break doesn't justify insubordination." Word of the rescue spread quickly through the outpost. In the mess hall that evening, heated arguments broke out among the soldiers. Some, like Private Matthews, defended Ghost's role in the rescue. Others grew even more hostile. "That mutt's cursed," Corporal Jensen spat. "First Jake, now this patrol. It's picking us off one by one." "The dog saved their lives," Matthews shot back. "How can you still think it's bad luck?" The division grew deeper as the day wore on. Aaron heard whispers from both sides. Some soldiers now left food out for Ghost, while others talked about driving it away for good. When night fell and the outpost grew quiet, Aaron slipped out of his bunk. The cold hit him like a wall as he made his way to the perimeter fence where he usually found Ghost. The moonlight caught the dog's white fur, now crusted with ice from the storm. Despite the brutal cold, Ghost's eyes remained alert, scanning the darkness beyond the fence. Aaron sat down beside the dog, careful not to make any sudden moves. "You're not what they think you are," he said softly. "You never were." Ghost's ears twitched at his voice but didn't move away. Ice crystals glittered in its fur like tiny stars. "I don't care what they say about you," Aaron continued, his breath visible in the frigid air. "I won't stop helping you. I promise." Ghost turned to look at him then, its blue eyes meeting his with an intelligence that made Aaron's chest tighten. For a moment, they sat together in comfortable silence, two outcasts finding understanding in each other's company. The outpost's atmosphere grew more hostile with each passing day. In the mess hall, soldiers who once shared meals and jokes now sat at separate tables, eyeing each other with suspicion. The morning coffee ritual turned into a tense affair as soldiers argued over Ghost's presence. "That dog's been watching over us," Private Matthews insisted, gripping his coffee mug tightly. "It led Warner straight to our missing patrol." "And what about the equipment failures?" Sergeant Miller countered from across the room. "The broken radio? The supply shortages? All started when Warner began feeding that cursed mutt." Aaron felt the weight of hostile stares as he ate his meals. Some soldiers deliberately bumped into him in the hallways or forgot, to include him in routine briefings. Yet he wasn't completely alone. Corporal Diaz and a small group of supporters helped him care for Ghost, secretly leaving food in hidden spots around the base. "Don't let them get to you," Diaz told Aaron one evening, slipping him an extra portion from the mess hall. "Some folks need something to blame when things go wrong." Ghost's behavior changed too. Instead of keeping to the shadows, the dog now patrolled openly near the barracks. When Private Rodriguez wandered too close to an unstable snowbank, Ghost's sharp barking drove him back. When two soldiers started walking toward a patch of thin ice, Ghost's growls made them choose another path. The tension came to a head during an evening patrol. Aaron walked the perimeter with Private Chen, one of his few allies, when Ghost appeared suddenly, barking urgently. The dog ran to a section of fence, pawing at the snow beneath it. "What's it doing?" Chen asked, raising his rifle. Aaron knelt down and brushed away the snow, revealing a large gap where the fence had pulled away from its post. Fresh boot prints in the snow led toward the opening. As they watched, a dark figure approached through the falling snow, freezing when it spotted them. "Enemy scout!" Chen shouted, raising the alarm. The figure turned and fled, leaving behind a dropped wire cutter. Within minutes, the sergeant arrived with backup. While soldiers repaired the fence, Aaron explained how Ghost had alerted them to the breach. "Pure coincidence," the sergeant declared, his voice hard. "The dog probably smelled food near the fence. Nothing more." But Aaron's supporters saw it differently. That night, more soldiers than ever left food for Ghost, while others spat on the ground when the dog passed by. The division in the unit grew deeper, like a crack in the winter ice, threatening to split the outpost in two. The morning sun barely penetrated the thick mountain clouds as Aaron made his way along the perimeter trail. His boots crunched in the fresh snow, and his breath came out in white puffs. Something made him glance over his shoulder, and he caught a glimpse of Ghost's gray fur blending with the shadows of the rocks. The dog moved like a whisper, staying just far enough away to avoid detection, but close enough to keep Aaron in sight. "You watching over me now?" Aaron murmured, a small smile playing on his lips. The trail curved around a rocky outcropping, and Aaron's attention turned to checking the security markers. His foot hit a patch of black ice hidden beneath the snow. In an instant, he was down, pain shooting through his ankle as he landed awkwardly. "Great," he muttered, trying to stand. His ankle buckled under his weight, sending fresh waves of pain up his leg. The steep mountainside dropped away to his right, making every movement precarious. A familiar bark echoed off the rocks. Ghost appeared at the top of the trail, its blue eyes fixed on Aaron. The dog barked again, more urgently this time, and trotted a few steps to the left before looking back at him. Aaron hesitated, remembering all the warnings about following Ghost. But his ankle throbbed, and the path ahead looked treacherous. Making his decision, he hobbled in Ghost's direction. The dog led him along a gentler slope, away from the steep drop-off. The path was wider here, with more stable footing. Ghost stayed close, matching Aaron's slow pace until the outpost came into view. Then, like mist dissolving in sunlight, the dog vanished into the swirling snow. Later in the mess hall, Aaron described what happened to Corporal Diaz. His voice carried across the room, drawing attention from nearby tables. "That dog saved you from a nasty fall," Diaz said, nodding thoughtfully. "Or led him right into danger," Private Miller cut in from 2 tables over. "What were you doing out there alone anyway, Warner?" "He wasn't alone," Matthews defended. "Ghost was watching his back, like it's been watching all of ours." The argument spread through the mess hall like wildfire. Soldiers rose from their seats, voices growing louder as they took sides. The clash of metal rang out as someone knocked over a tray. "Enough!" The sergeant's voice cut through the chaos. He stood in the doorway, his face dark with anger. "Warner, this nonsense ends now. That dog comes near my camp again, and I'll have it driven into the mountains where it belongs. Is that clear?" The mess hall fell silent. Aaron met the sergeant's gaze and nodded slowly, his jaw tight. But they all knew Ghost wouldn't stay away. And deep down, Aaron was grateful for that. The mountain winds howled through the outpost as Aaron tossed and turned in his bunk. Sleep refused to come, his mind racing with thoughts of the day's confrontations. Finally giving up, he pulled on his heavy coat and stepped outside, into the biting cold. The storm clouds loomed on the horizon, their dark mass illuminated by occasional flashes of lightning. As Aaron's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he spotted a familiar shape near the storage sheds. Ghost was pacing back and forth, its normally quiet demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. The dog's head was turned toward the mountains, and every few seconds, it let out a sharp, urgent bark. Aaron's chest tightened. He'd seen this behavior before, when Ghost had led them to the tripwire, and again when it guided them to the lost patrol. Something wasn't right. Moving quietly, Aaron made his way toward the storage area. Ghost acknowledged his presence with a quick glance, but kept its attention fixed on the mountainside. Following the dog's gaze, Aaron scanned the snow-covered slope. At first, he saw nothing in the darkness, but then his eyes caught something unusual, subtle disturbances in the fresh snow, barely visible in the dim light. Aaron crouched down to examine the tracks more closely. They were recent, maybe an hour old at most, and they led directly toward the outpost. His heart rate quickened as he recognized the deliberate pattern of the footprints, enemy scouts. Without hesitation, Aaron sprinted to alert the soldiers on guard duty. "Multiple tracks on the north slope," he reported breathlessly. "They're fresh, heading straight for the base." The guards mobilized immediately, their training kicking in. Within minutes, they intercepted 3 scouts carrying explosive charges. The would-be attackers were caught completely off guard, having expected the approaching storm to cover their approach. After the scouts were secured, the sergeant arrived to assess the situation. He examined the confiscated explosives with a grim expression. "Good catch," he said to the guards, deliberately ignoring Aaron. "Lucky we spotted them when we did." "Sir," Aaron spoke up, "Ghost was the one who—" The sergeant cut him off with a sharp gesture. "We would have found them regardless, Warner. That's what perimeter checks are for." He turned away, ending the conversation. Later, as the adrenaline wore off, Aaron found Corporal Diaz near the mess hall. "The sergeant's wrong, you know," Diaz said quietly. "Those scouts would have made it past the perimeter in this weather. Ghost saved lives tonight." Aaron watched as Ghost's silhouette became visible for a moment against the darkening sky. The dog paused, looking back at them once before melting into the swirling snow of the approaching storm. "I know," Aaron replied, "and I'm not going to stop trusting it, no matter what anyone says." The sergeant's voice echoed through the cramped meeting room as he stood before the assembled unit. His weathered face was tight with frustration as he scanned the faces of his soldiers. "This ends now," he declared, arms crossed over his chest. "The division in this unit over a stray dog has gone too far. We're soldiers, not a bunch of superstitious children." The room remained silent, but Aaron could feel the tension crackling like static electricity. Some soldiers nodded in agreement with the sergeant, while others stared at the floor, avoiding eye contact. "From this moment forward," the sergeant continued, "anyone caught feeding or interacting with that dog will face severe disciplinary action. No exceptions. This isn't a debate. It's an order." Aaron's hands clenched into fists under the table. His jaw ached from keeping quiet, but he forced himself to remain still. Making a scene would only make things worse for Ghost and anyone who wanted to help. After the meeting, Corporal Diaz caught up with Aaron outside the barracks. "Hey," he said softly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "We'll figure something out. There are ways to help without being seen." A few other soldiers nodded as they passed by, their subtle gestures telling Aaron he wasn't alone. Near the edge of camp, Ghost's familiar form appeared briefly between the buildings, its presence drawing mixed reactions from the passing soldiers. Some quickened their pace, while others paused to watch the dog with thoughtful expressions. As evening settled over the outpost, Aaron waited until the night patrol passed his position near the supply shed. His heart pounded as he pulled a small package of saved food from his pocket. The familiar crunch of snow told him Ghost was nearby, watching and waiting. Aaron placed the food in their usual spot, partially hidden behind some crates. He watched as Ghost emerged from the shadows, moving with careful grace. The dog's eyes met his for a moment before it began to eat. What Aaron didn't notice was the figure watching from the shadows of the communications building. Private Matthews, one of the sergeant's most loyal soldiers, observed the entire interaction. His face set in a hard frown as he turned to report what he'd seen. Aaron made his way back to the barracks, feeling a sense of peace despite breaking the sergeant's orders. Seeing Ghost fed and safe was worth the risk. He climbed into his bunk, unaware that his act of kindness had already been reported. The morning sun had barely crept over the mountain peaks when Sergeant Logan's voice boomed across the compound. "Warner, front and center!" Aaron's stomach dropped as he emerged from the medical bay. The entire unit was already gathered, their faces a mix of sympathy and judgment. Private Matthews stood smugly beside the sergeant, arms crossed. "Last night you were seen feeding that dog," the sergeant said, his voice cold as the mountain air. "Direct violation of my orders." Aaron straightened his back, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Sir, with all due respect, Ghost has helped us multiple times. The cave rescue, the perimeter breach, the enemy scouts." "Enough!" The sergeant cut him off. "Those were coincidences. That dog is a distraction this unit can't afford." He turned to address the gathered soldiers. "Form a patrol. Drive that animal out of our area. Use warning shots if necessary." "Sir, please." Aaron stepped forward, his heart racing. "Ghost isn't a threat." "You're confined to the medical bay, Warner. That's an order." The sergeant's tone left no room for argument. Aaron watched helplessly as a group of soldiers gathered their weapons. Some wouldn't meet his eyes, while others seemed almost eager for the task. He caught sight of Diaz in the group, who gave him a subtle nod, a silent promise to ensure Ghost wouldn't be harmed. The sound of boots crunching through snow faded as the patrol moved out. Aaron paced in the medical bay, flinching at each distant crack of gunfire that echoed off the mountains. Each shot felt like a physical blow. Hours passed before Diaz found him. "Ghost is okay," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "We fired high, just noise to chase it away. The dog headed deep into the mountains, but it wasn't hurt." Aaron nodded, grateful for the news but unable to shake his guilt. "I should have done more," he whispered. That night, Aaron sat on the steps outside his barracks, staring at the moonlit mountains where Ghost had disappeared. The outpost felt emptier somehow, the silence heavy with Ghost's absence. Snow began to fall softly, erasing any trace that the dog had ever been there. "I'll make this right," Aaron promised quietly to the darkness. "Somehow." The night grew colder, and the mountains loomed like silent guardians, holding their secrets close. Around him, the outpost settled into an uneasy quiet. But Aaron couldn't shake the growing sense of dread in his gut. The mountains had grown eerily quiet in the days following Ghost's departure. Aaron went through his duties mechanically, trying to ignore the empty spaces where the dog used to watch from the shadows. Even the soldiers who had wanted Ghost gone seemed subdued, as if the forced exile had cast a heavy gloom over the outpost. It was during these quiet, early morning hours, just before dawn, that the first shell hit. The explosion rocked the mountainside, the sound bouncing off the peaks like thunder. Aaron, who had stepped outside to retrieve more bandages from the supply tent, froze in place. More shells followed, their impacts growing closer. But it wasn't the artillery that made Aaron's blood run cold. It was the low rumble that followed. Looking up at the mountainside, he saw it, a wall of white rushing down toward them. "Avalanche!" he screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the deafening roar of moving snow. The world turned white. Aaron dove behind a concrete barrier as the avalanche swept over the base. The sound was overwhelming, a mixture of cracking wood, crushing metal, and the thunderous flow of countless tons of snow. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost as deafening. Aaron emerged from his shelter, and his heart nearly stopped. Where the barracks had stood was now a field of white. Supply buildings had collapsed under the weight of the snow. Faint cries for help echoed from beneath the drifts. "Hold on!" he shouted, scrambling toward the nearest sound. His hands plunged into the snow, digging frantically. But each shovelful seemed meaningless against the massive expanse of white. Sweat froze on his face as panic set in. There were too many people trapped, and he was just one person. Then he heard it, a sharp, familiar bark cutting through the chaos. Aaron spun around, hardly daring to believe it. There, standing on top of a snowbank, was Ghost. The dog's fur was covered in frost, but its eyes were alert and focused. Without hesitation, Ghost began digging furiously at a specific spot near one of the collapsed barracks, barking between frantic pawfuls of snow. Aaron's heart leaped. "Ghost!" he called out, already running toward the dog. The husky had returned when they needed it most, and Aaron knew exactly what to do. He dropped to his knees beside Ghost and began digging where the dog indicated, his renewed hope giving him fresh strength. Working side by side, Aaron and Ghost made quick progress through the snow. The dog's paws moved with purpose, and within minutes they broke through to an air pocket. Aaron's heart jumped when he heard familiar voices below. "We're here!" Dia's muffled voice called out. "There's 4 of us!" Aaron dug faster, his muscles burning with effort. When the hole was wide enough, he peered down to see Diaz and 3 other soldiers huddled together, their breath visible in the freezing air. They were alive, but shivering badly. "I've got some emergency supplies," Aaron said, pulling a medical kit from his jacket. He passed down thermal blankets and checked each soldier for injuries. One had a nasty gash on his forehead, which Aaron quickly bandaged. Ghost didn't wait. The dog was already moving to another spot, barking urgently. Its white fur was caked with snow, but determination burned in its eyes. "Go," Diaz urged, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. "We can climb out. Find the others." Aaron followed Ghost to another location where they found 2 more soldiers trapped beneath collapsed beams. The rescue was trickier this time. The space was tighter, and one soldier had a broken arm. Aaron worked carefully, using his medical training to stabilize the injury before helping them out. The temperature was dropping rapidly. Aaron could feel the cold seeping through his clothes, but Ghost showed no signs of stopping. The dog moved from spot to spot, its nose leading them to more survivors. During one rescue, Aaron stepped onto unstable snow. The ground shifted beneath him, and suddenly he was sliding down with a fresh avalanche of powder. Panic gripped him as the white consumed his vision. But then he felt strong jaws grip his jacket. Ghost pulled with surprising strength, dragging Aaron to safer ground. "Thank you," Aaron gasped, hugging the dog briefly before they continued their work. Hours passed in a blur of digging, treating injuries, and following Ghost's lead. By the time they reached the last survivor, Aaron's hands were numb and Ghost was moving more slowly, clearly exhausted. But they didn't stop until everyone they could find was safe. In the intact section of the base, 11 rescued soldiers huddled around emergency heaters. Many were injured but alive, thanks to the unlikely partnership between a medic and a dog they'd once feared. "I can't believe it," one soldier said, watching Ghost collapse near Aaron's feet. "We were wrong about him all along." "Ghost knew exactly where to find us," Diaz added, his voice full of wonder. "Without him and Aaron, we wouldn't have made it." The other soldiers nodded in agreement, their earlier superstitions forgotten in the face of what they'd witnessed. Aaron sat down beside Ghost, finally allowing himself to rest. The dog's eyes were already closing, its mission complete. Aaron gently examined Ghost's paw, noting the raw spots where the dog had dug through ice and snow for hours. The husky lay still, allowing Aaron to clean and bandage the injuries, a far cry from their first tentative meeting weeks ago. "Here," a voice said. Aaron looked up to see Miller, one of the soldiers who had thrown rocks at Ghost just days before. He held out a bowl of warm water and some clean rags. "Least I can do after, well, everything." Other soldiers gathered around, their faces showing a mix of shame and gratitude. Thompson, another former critic, knelt beside them. "That dog found me first, you know. I was running out of air, panicking. Then I heard the barking. And—" he shook his head. "I was wrong about Ghost. We all were." As Aaron worked, more soldiers approached to offer help or simply watch. Ghost's eyes stayed alert despite exhaustion, tracking each movement but no longer showing fear. The sergeant emerged from the medical bay, his arm in a sling. His face was unreadable as he surveyed the scene. "The dog did good work today," he said stiffly. "But that doesn't change the fact that its presence has caused problems. We can't risk—" "Problems?" Diaz interrupted, stepping forward. "Ghost just saved half the unit." The sergeant's jaw tightened. One good deed doesn't erase years of bad omens. Once we're evacuated, the dog goes back to the mountains where it belongs. Murmurs of disagreement rippled through the group. Aaron stood slowly, his hand resting on Ghost's head. "Sir, with respect, you're wrong about Ghost. This isn't about omens or luck." The soldiers fell silent as Aaron continued. "Look at what Ghost has survived out here. Blizzards, battles, loneliness. That's not a curse. That's strength. The same strength we're supposed to have as soldiers." Aaron gestured to the devastated base around them. "Ghost could have left after we drove it away. Instead, it came back to help us. It knew exactly where to find everyone, because it's been watching over this outpost for years, not haunting it, protecting it." Several soldiers nodded in agreement. Even those who had been skeptical seemed moved by Aaron's words. "Ghost isn't some phantom bringing bad luck," Aaron said firmly. "It's a survivor who chose to stay and help others survive too. If that's not the kind of ally we want watching our backs up here, then maybe we're the ones who need to rethink our priorities." The sergeant's expression remained hard, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. He looked at the soldiers gathered around Ghost, men who hours ago had been buried alive, now standing together because of a dog they'd once feared. The morning after the avalanche brought clear skies and bitter cold. Soldiers trudged through knee-deep snow, forming lines to pass recovered supplies from the buried storage areas. Ghost stayed close to Aaron as he helped coordinate the medical inventory, the dog's presence drawing mixed reactions from the passing soldiers. "Thanks again," Thompson said quietly as he handed Aaron a box of bandages. "For yesterday, I mean." His eyes flickered to Ghost, who sat alertly nearby. Aaron nodded, noting how even the most superstitious soldiers now gave Ghost respectful distance rather than fearful avoidance. The dog had earned that much at least. As evening approached, Aaron noticed Ghost's behavior change. The husky's ears perked up, and it began pacing near the far edge of the camp, letting out short, urgent barks. Aaron had learned to trust these warnings. "What is it, boy?" he asked, following Ghost toward the perimeter. The dog led him to a section of fence partially buried in snow from the avalanche. Aaron's heart quickened as he spotted unusual depressions in the snow. Boot prints partially filled in, but still visible. They led toward the mountain pass, disappearing into the gathering darkness. These weren't from their own patrols. The pattern was wrong, and they were too fresh. "Ghost found something," Aaron reported to the sergeant minutes later, pointing out the tracks. "These are recent. Could be another scouting party planning to take advantage of our weakened defenses." The sergeant studied the prints, his expression thoughtful. Ghost stood at attention nearby, still watching the mountain pass. The old soldier's eyes moved from the tracks to the dog and back again. First the tripwire, then the infiltrators before the storm. "Now this," the sergeant said slowly. "The dog's been trying to warn us all along, hasn't it?" "Yes, sir," Aaron replied simply. The sergeant straightened up, adjusting his sling. "Miller, Thompson, gather a patrol. We need eyes on that pass before dark." He paused, looking at Ghost. "And log this in the report. Dog spotted suspicious activity at 1800 hours. Aaron felt a small smile tug at his lips as he watched the patrol gear up and head out. Ghost had already melted back into the shadows, but Aaron knew the dog would be watching, ready to raise the alarm if needed. The mountain wind whipped snow around Aaron and the small patrol as they followed the tracks Ghost had discovered. The dog moved ahead of them, nose close to the ground, leading them through the treacherous terrain. Despite the sergeant's objections to bringing Ghost along, the patrol leader had insisted the dog's tracking abilities could prove valuable. "Hold up," Thompson whispered, raising his fist. Through the swirling snow, a dark shape emerged, a small structure nestled against the mountainside. The patrol crouched behind a snowbank, observing what appeared to be an abandoned enemy outpost. Empty crates and equipment lay scattered around the entrance, partially buried in fresh snow. Ghost's behavior changed suddenly. The dog's ears pricked forward, and it began pawing at the snow near a section of the building's outer wall. Aaron watched as the husky uncovered the corner of what looked like a trap door. "Sir," Aaron called softly to the patrol leader, "I think Ghost found something." The soldiers carefully approached and cleared the snow, revealing a hidden storage compartment. Inside, they discovered a cache of weapons, and more importantly, detailed plans for a coordinated assault on their base. The documents showed the enemy had been studying their defenses for weeks, planning to strike while they were still recovering from the avalanche. As they photographed the documents and gathered intelligence, Ghost suddenly tensed. The dog's low growl warned them seconds before they heard voices approaching through the pass. The patrol quickly sealed the compartment and retreated, Ghost leading them along a safe route back to base. In the sergeant's office, the patrol leader spread out the copied documents while Aaron explained Ghost's role in the discovery. The sergeant studied the plans with a grim expression, occasionally glancing at Ghost, who sat quietly by Aaron's side. "This intelligence could save the entire outpost," the sergeant admitted gruffly. He looked at Ghost for a long moment before adding, "The dog can stay, for now. But it's still your responsibility, Warner." Aaron nodded, knowing this grudging acceptance was as close to approval as the sergeant would get. As they left the office, several soldiers patted Ghost's head or offered quiet words of thanks. The dog remained alert but seemed more at ease, as if sensing the shift in the unit's attitude. Later that evening, Aaron watched Ghost patrol the perimeter, its white fur blending with the snow. Though the sergeant still viewed Ghost as a potential risk, Aaron knew the dog had finally begun to earn the trust of even the most doubtful soldiers. The discovery of the enemy outpost had proved what Aaron had known all along. Ghost wasn't just a survivor, but a protector of all those who called this harsh mountain post home. The mountain outpost hummed with tense activity as soldiers fortified weak points and distributed their dwindling supplies. Aaron moved between the wounded, checking bandages and organizing what remained of their medical resources. His hands worked steadily, but his mind raced with worry about the coming fight. Ghost hadn't left his side all day, following him from patient to patient. The dog's usual calm demeanor had shifted to one of restless vigilance. Every few minutes, Ghost would pause and stare intently at the mountain slopes, ears twitching at sounds only it could hear. "He knows something's coming," Diaz said, helping Aaron stack medical supplies in the makeshift infirmary. "Never seen him this worked up before." The attack began just after midnight. The first explosions lit up the sky, followed by the sharp crack of gunfire. Enemy soldiers emerged from the darkness, their advance hidden by the swirling snow. The unit scrambled to defensive positions, fighting to protect their weakened perimeter. Ghost's barking cut through the chaos, sharp, urgent warnings that saved lives. When 3 enemy soldiers tried sneaking around the eastern corner, Ghost's alert gave the defenders precious seconds to redirect their fire. The dog moved like a phantom through the battlefield, appearing wherever the danger was greatest. Aaron was retrieving more bandages from the supply area when he heard Ghost growl. He turned to see an enemy scout, knife drawn, frozen in mid-step. Ghost lunged forward, teeth bared, giving Aaron time to shout a warning. Nearby soldiers rushed in, quickly subduing the infiltrator. "Good boy," Aaron whispered, his heart pounding. Ghost pressed against his leg briefly before disappearing back into the fight. The battle raged for hours. Ghost's warnings continued to prove invaluable, helping the unit anticipate and counter each enemy movement. The dog seemed to be everywhere at once, its white fur flashing through the darkness like a protective spirit. When the enemy finally retreated, leaving their dead and wounded behind, the mountain air grew quiet again. The unit had survived, though not without loss. As the soldiers regrouped, checking on the wounded and securing the perimeter, they spoke in hushed, amazed tones about Ghost's actions during the fight. The sergeant stood at the edge of the battlefield, surveying the aftermath. His expression changed when Ghost approached, sitting calmly beside him. For a long moment, the sergeant said nothing, just stared at the dog that had helped save his unit. "Guess I was wrong about you," he finally muttered, reaching down to pat Ghost's head. The gesture sent a ripple of surprise through the watching soldiers. Ghost accepted the touch with dignity, then trotted back to Aaron's side, ready to help with the wounded. The morning after the battle dawned cold and clear. Soldiers moved silently through the outpost, gathering their fallen comrades and preparing them for burial. The snow was stained with patches of red, a stark reminder of the night's violence. Where there had once been division among the unit, now there was only shared grief and respect. Ghost limped alongside Aaron as he made his rounds, checking on the wounded. The dog's white fur was matted with dirt and blood, some of it his own. Aaron noticed several cuts along Ghost's flank and a deep gash above his right paw. "Let me take care of those wounds," Aaron said softly, patting the medical table. Ghost jumped up without hesitation, trusting Aaron completely. As Aaron cleaned and bandaged the injuries, he felt the exhaustion in Ghost's body. The dog's eyes were heavy, but they still watched Aaron with unwavering loyalty. The sergeant approached them while Aaron worked, his boots crunching in the snow. He stood quietly for a moment, watching the gentle interaction between man and dog. "I was wrong about him," the sergeant finally said, his gruff voice softer than usual. All this time, I thought he was bringing us bad luck. Turns out he was trying to protect us, just like he tried to protect Jake." Aaron nodded, continuing to tend to Ghost's wounds. "He's earned his place here," the sergeant continued, reaching out to pat Ghost's head. "But maybe this isn't where he belongs forever. A dog like this deserves more than endless battles and frozen mountains." "I know," Aaron replied, surprised by the lump forming in his throat. "He's done more than enough for us." As winter began to release its grip on the mountains, the snow started to thin. One crisp morning, Aaron stepped out of his barracks to find Ghost standing at the perimeter of the camp. The dog's wounds had healed, leaving only faint scars beneath his thick fur. He stood tall and alert, looking out toward the distant peaks where the sun was just beginning to paint the snow in shades of gold. Ghost turned his head, meeting Aaron's gaze one last time. In those clear blue eyes, Aaron saw both wildness and wisdom, the spirit of a creature that had chosen to help them, but was never meant to be tamed. With graceful steps, Ghost began trotting toward the mountains, his white fur blending with the patches of remaining snow. Aaron watched until Ghost disappeared into the wilderness, feeling his heart both swell with pride and ache with loss. The dog had taught them all about courage, loyalty, and the power of looking past their fears to see the truth. The mountain outpost looked different in the spring sunshine. Aaron folded his uniforms and packed them carefully into his duffel bag, pausing occasionally to look out the barracks window. The snow had mostly melted, revealing patches of hardy mountain grass beneath. His deployment was ending, and a mix of emotions washed over him as he prepared to leave. His fingers brushed against the worn first aid kit he'd used to treat Ghost's injuries that first night. The memory was so vivid, the dog's wary eyes, the gentle way it had allowed Aaron to help despite its fear. Since then, everything had changed. The avalanche, the battles, the nights spent watching Ghost guard their perimeter. It all felt like both yesterday and a lifetime ago. "Need help with that?" Corporal Diaz asked from the doorway. "Almost done," Aaron replied, zipping up his bag. "Just one more thing I need to do before I go." Aaron hiked the familiar path to the cave where Ghost had led them during the blizzard rescue. The spring thaw made the trek easier, though patches of ice still lingered in the shadows. When he reached the cave entrance, he paused, remembering the desperate night they'd taken shelter there. Inside, the cave was exactly as he remembered, the rough walls still bearing the marks of previous visitors. But something new caught his eye. Fresh paw prints in the muddy cave floor, distinctively large and familiar. Aaron's heart lifted at the sight. Ghost was still out there, still watching over these mountains. Taking out his knife, Aaron carefully carved a simple message into the cave wall near where Jake's old markings remained. Ghost, guardian of the mountain. Below it, he added the date and a small paw print. It wasn't much, but it felt right to leave some record of the remarkable dog who had changed so many lives. As Aaron worked, he thought about everything Ghost had taught them. The dog had shown them that sometimes the things we fear most are actually trying to protect us. That loyalty and courage could appear in the most unexpected forms. That survival often meant trusting your instincts, and sometimes trusting others despite your fears. Standing back, Aaron looked at his handiwork. The simple carving would remain long after he left, telling Ghost's story to future soldiers who might seek shelter in this cave. The thought brought him comfort as he prepared to leave the mountains behind. Back at the outpost, Aaron shouldered his duffel bag and took one last look at the vast landscape. Somewhere out there, Ghost was roaming free, probably still watching over travelers and soldiers alike. Though Aaron knew he would never see the dog again, he felt Ghost's influence would stay with him forever, a reminder that even in the coldest places, warmth could be found in unexpected connections. If you enjoyed the story of Aaron and Ghost, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.